Hey, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where we're dialing in from. Let us know in the chat, by the way, where you're joining us from today for day 3 of AI Build Week. I'm Keenan, and I've been your host this week. I will also be your presenter today and for the next couple days. And I'm excited for folks to kind of dive in and look at the topic we have today, which is how we built a tool called RetoolGPT. So before we get started, again, kind of let us know in the chat where you're calling in from today would be great. And like Taylor mentioned, what one thing is this week you've learned so far, if you've been with us for days 1 and 2.
Okay.
If not,
she just finished
we
signing
hope
in.
you join us for day 3. We're glad you're here for day 3, and hopefully you're here for day 4 and 5 tomorrow and Friday. So again, thanks everybody for being here, and we will get going. All right. So like I mentioned, today we are going to be talking about how we built a tool called RetoolGPT. If this is what you're here for, you're in the right place. If not, I hope you stick around anyway, because basically we're going to talk about this tool that we decided we needed, where we wanted a sort of ChatGPT type experience, but that knew everything about all of our internal company data. And that was a thing that had a few challenges associated with it. So we're going to walk through those real quick. So just an overview of kind of what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to do a very quick review of what we learned in the first couple of days. Those topics kind of build on each other and are pretty important for what we're talking about today. So for the folks that weren't here, we're just going to briefly talk about the couple things that we learned there. And then we're going to go into the problem that led us to build this in the first place. We're going to take a look at some of the front end pieces, some of the back end pieces, and then we're going to look at kind of what the future of this tool looks like. So this will be a little bit of a higher level sort of architectural talk. Some of our feedback from the first 2 days is where Angelique has been, in the weeds building things in Retool, is that we want to kind of focus a little bit more on the architecture. So in this case, we'll pull back a little bit and look at, how we built this tool, what we use to do it, but we won't be kind of in the weeds building as much. So hopefully that's helpful to kind of give you a sense of how to build these sorts of AI-powered applications in Retool. So days 1 and 2, if you weren't here on Monday with us, Angelique talked to all about different models and which ones have their advantages for certain use cases, how to compare them, etc. But basically the gist of that is that, all of the large language models and AI tools that we have access to have different pros and cons, different strengths and weaknesses. And so for your particular use case, it's always important to kind of experiment with those different models and figure out which one works best for you and which one you feel like gives you the best results. Because even for a particular use case, certain people might prefer different models, and that'll come into play a little bit later, as we'll see. So yesterday on day 2, we dove into all things vectors, talking about how unstructured data gets transformed into a mathematical representation of itself, and that lets large language models and AI tools access and use that data more easily. And we'll see that come into play today as well. All of this internal company data we had spread across all these different systems was super unstructured, and we needed a way to basically work with that in a large language model context. So if you didn't catch either of those two sessions, we have community threads for each of those, which you'll be able to find in the Retool community. You can go back, watch the recordings. We post the Q&A there from Zoom. And if you have any questions that you weren't able to ask live in the session, you can do that on this community threads as well. Since you're here, though, just a reminder that you can post questions in the chat or using the Zoom Q&A tool. And our Retool folks who are in the chat, Taylor and Sarah and Tess, Daniel, we'll get to those and we'll bring all those back around at the end. Great. So that was day 1 and 2, but y'all are here on day 3. So let's dive into that. And basically, RetoolGPT as a system came out of a problem that we had internally. We had data absolutely everywhere. We have public documentation for Retool, which is helpful for support folks and people who are trying to understand new features and things that we've shipped. We have a change log that's there. We have a bunch of internal company data, especially for our sales teams and things in Confluence. Our engineering team largely works in Linear. Myself on the marketing team and other folks do a lot of work in Google Drive and Google Docs. And we also just have a lot of just random, PDFs and things that, are sitting around and need to be, useful. Either they're less useful trapped on individual people's computers, or they're on Google Drive where there's a public link, but there like needs to be some sort of system that brings all of these things together, because a common question we were getting was, okay, cool. I know that's in a document somewhere, but what system is it on? I don't know where to look. I'm going through all these systems just to find, whether it's in Google Drive or Confluence or anything like that. So that was kind of the problem. And we needed to find a way to basically solve for that. And so everybody also had their own slightly different tool preference. At the time, I was using Anthropic's Claude for most things. Lots of people enjoyed ChatGPT. We had folks who were using Perplexity, or people who were really invested in using Gemini. And so there was all of this kind of copy pasting. We were worried about, our data going everywhere. Different AI providers obviously have different standards on whether they train future models on your data and things like that. And so we wanted to kind of rein all of that in and control all that, and also eliminate a ton of the copy pasting that I know at least I was doing, and I'm sure other folks on our team were doing as well. And so that's basically where RetoolGPT was born. And I'm going to leave this up on the slide for a minute just so you can kind of take a look and take in all the different pieces here. We'll be going through some of these in the talk. But if you're used to a tool like ChatGPT or Claude or even Gemini, this interface will look pretty familiar to you. But this is all completely custom built in Retool. And you can see that in this example, I'm asking it, what days do we have off for holidays for, June and July of this year. And so we had, the Juneteenth holiday, and we had July 4th as well. And so you can see also, it says if you need more details or context, you can check the full calendar here. And that, would take me into Confluence where it actually pulled the data from. So instead of just, kind of generally knowing what holidays companies have off, this was able to reference our actual published holiday schedule and provide me this answer here. So instead of having to remember whether that was, on my Google Calendar or in Google Drive as a doc or in Confluence, I was just able to go here and ask RetoolGPT that same question. So let's kind of dive in and take a look at how this works. So I mentioned before, we'll split this kind of into front end and back end, and we'll start on the front end of things. So I want to just demo this. Obviously is a pretty rich interface here, but there's a lot behind the scenes, as we'll see. And I just wanted to flag that if you're just getting started with this kind of LLM chat interaction, Retool actually does have a pre-built chat component. So we're over here in the Retool IDE. If we drag our LLM chat to the canvas, we can see that we get this kind of pre-populated AI action where we can choose, which model we want to use for this chat. I'm going to choose GPT-4o just because that's one that I kind of personally like. And I'll save and close this. But now, sort of without any additional configuration, because I already have my OpenAI key added to my Retool account, I'm able to basically have this sort of chat experience here. So I can ask, why is the sky blue? And you see it'll think a little bit, but then GPT-4o will start kind of returning its response to me. And so a lot of things that you need to do to create a kind of cohesive and comprehensive chat experience, we already take care of for you. You have the ability to, download the logs of your chat, to clear out the history. You can copy an individual message. And if you see in the query here, we're also maintaining the message history for you. So you can see it knows that I already sent this "why is the sky blue" message. So part of kind of building this chat on your own is maintaining that state of the chat, the message history, so that, if I ask, is it really blue? If I just sent that individual message to a large language model, it wouldn't know what I was talking about. But because, it has the context of the message history that I've already sent, it knows that I'm talking about the sky. We can kind of pick up the conversation there. So if you're looking for just kind of an out-of-the-box sort of chat experience, this chat component is really helpful. You can, of course, using Retool's sort of double curly brace syntax here, inject any sort of data that is present in your app anywhere else. So you can make your prompts super detailed and full of context, even inside the scope of a larger app. So just wanted to note that as a way that, if you're kind of getting started with a bare bones starter version of this, that may be the way to go. Cool. But obviously, here, looking back at that screenshot that we just saw, that is an even more richer experience going on. We have sort of the ability to start multiple threads, and all of that. And so there were a few different pieces that we needed here. So number one, we'll go over this in just a little bit when I flip back over to the screen, but all of these are individual Retool components. So everything from buttons to text areas and things, they're all dragged onto the canvas and configured as individual Retool components. So unlike the chat component, where it was just one component that contained all of those things, this allows us to customize, how the buttons look, how the text box responds to input, and all sorts of other things like that. So it's just kind of an example of, we covered the full spectrum of, you just want everything done for you in a pre-made chat component, or you can really break that out and go really in the weeds with building your own sorts of interfaces. And we've seen people build some very complicated interfaces in Retool, and that's one of the reasons why we keep the system so flexible. So secondly, we used Retool database, which is built into Retool to manage things like threads and messages. So the chat component stores all the messages in a given thread to keep that context. But when we want people to be able to leave the tool and come back, that's when we need some more persistent storage. And so instead of reaching for another database tool or anything like that, we use the database that's built into Retool to basically save when a person creates a new thread, when they add messages to that thread. All of that is saved in Retool database, so that for each user, they can come back and they can see all their past chats, which is what you would expect with a tool like ChatGPT, for example. And like I mentioned, everybody had a slightly different preference on what tools they wanted to use and what models they wanted to use. And so we wanted to give folks the ability to do that sort of model customization as well. So you'll notice if we tab over here to the actual interface itself, there's this drop down up here where I can choose, a couple GPT models, an OpenAI model, Anthropic model, or a DeepSeek model that's being served through Grok, right? So no matter which model you feel like gives you the best output for your tasks, you can choose that here, and you can even sort of move between them and decide which one gives you the best output. So I'll just leave this up here for a minute and let folks kind of scan over. But you can see all of these components here are what I was talking about, where everything's kind of custom configured and custom placed. And the behavior, like this sidebar being able to be toggled on and off, those are things that we can control with JavaScript queries and things that run on the behind the scenes of the app, so that we have exactly the behavior that we want to, right? And so we have the ability to do everything from, again, talking to the model, starting a new thread here, which again creates a new row in that built-in Retool database. We can ask for help if we find out, if we think that something is broken over here from the folks that built this tool. And kind of the core functionalities down here of, okay, we can send a message, we can do things like search the web, upload documents, or this section over here, include vectors, is what we'll get to in just a second here. So at its current state, like, this is basically the architecture. We have kind of our core chat experience. We've connected it up to RetoolDB so that it can save things. And we've connected it to all the various and models that we have access to, right? So it can communicate with those models. It can write and read from, our Retool database. And this is pretty good. But at the moment, it's not any better than a tool like ChatGPT or Anthropic, just because, it is just using the underlying models. It's not using any of our sort of internal retool data yet. And so that's kind of the next thing that we need to get to. So that's where the backend comes in. And again, as a reminder, like we have data in all these different places. We kind of need to like centralize this somewhere. And you'll notice down here, that we have these three buttons that say include vectors. If we hover over these, we can see, linear issues, Retool public docs, and Confluence are things that we can sort of toggle on and off to include in our search. So we'll take a look at how these work in just a second. But that was basically the challenge we had. So I just want to kind of, as we move from front end to back end, just remind folks that you do have the ability to drop questions in chat. We tend to see folks have questions about these sorts of things, and I'm more than happy to answer those. That's why I'm here for y'all. So definitely drop those either in chat or in the Q&A if you have kind of things you want to dig deeper on as we go through the talk here. So cool. So we know we need to collect all of this data in one place. We need to expose it to large language models in a way that makes sense. We obviously, because we have so much information, we can't just dump all of it into the prompt and have the LLM sort it out. That would hit the context window of any model, even the Gemini models that have a huge context window. And so we needed to figure out something to solve this. Basically, how we did that is we combined Retool workflows with Retool vectors. So for those who don't know, Retool workflows is basically a tool that lets you, like you can see here, kind of lay out these different blocks on a canvas, have one chain to the other, and create these sort of logic flows and automations that do things either triggered by a workflow, which could be like a Slack message or somebody opening a pull request on GitHub or something, or triggered on a schedule, which is how we use them in this case. So, every 6 hours, every 12 hours, we have our workflow run and look at, okay, from any of our data sources, are there new pieces of data that we need or anything else we need to pull in? The second piece that came into play was Retool vectors. And so again, this was a large amount of our focus yesterday on day 2. So if you missed that, definitely go back into the community and find the replay and the Q&A for that. But essentially, Retool vectors allows us to take all of this unstructured data and turn it into a vector database that then we can pass to our large language model the relevant context from all of the documents that it has ingested. And it's able to use that in its response. So for example, that's how in our company calendar example, the LLM was able to know that our company calendar was on Confluence and it was able to link me there when I was looking for our days off for June and July. So let's take a look at specifically how this works by diving into a workflow that pulls in updates from Google Drive, right? So this is what a Retool workflow looks like for those of you who haven't seen it. And basically what this workflow does is we have a vector store that we wanted to update with a specific set of Google Docs, right? So in this case, what I'm doing here is I'm hard coding these Google Docs IDs. But you could very easily have this code step set up to look at a specific Google Drive folder, so that it would be a little bit more dynamic, right? So what we do is we have these hard-coded IDs. You could also alternatively do a lookup from a folder, and we basically loop through in this loop step here, and we get all of the contents of each of the documents, right? So you can see that we're running these sequentially. So it's looping through each document one at a time. It's getting the data and we say, include content from all the tabs. We don't know if this document has different tabs in it. Google Docs does now support tabs. And so, that's something we just want to make sure we get all of the content, right? So then here, because of how content is stored in Google Docs, we have to do a little bit of work to kind of compile it into one, main chunk of text that the large language model can interpret. So this is where kind of the power of Retool comes into play. We have, the ability to not only use sort of the pre-built actions that we have set up, but also at any time, you can just basically write your own code as well. And so here you can see I've basically created this JavaScript function that loops through the sort of complex data structure of what a Google Doc looks like internally and returns it as essentially just a string of text, right? So for each of the docs, we loop through and compile that text. And then this final step here is basically where we're actually updating the vector. So you see, once again, we're sequentially looping through and we're saying, okay, for every one of these vectors, Based on the name of the Google Doc, we know the vector is already stored under that name. Update it with the value, which is the combined text data that we were getting here. And we're doing what's called an upsert action here, which is pretty helpful, which means we don't have to decide whether we're creating a new vector because it doesn't exist, or whether we need to update an existing one. An upsert basically is kind of a combination of those two things, insert and update. And so if a vector with this title already exists, it will overwrite the contents of that vector with our new content, which is how updates happen. But if, for example, someone drops a new Google Doc that we want to also vectorize, we don't need to handle that case separately. It will just insert it as a new vector and then update it in the future as we go. So this is a relatively simple workflow. We can kind of zoom out here and see just a couple steps. But this means that all of our sort of Google Docs data that we want in a vector can now be in that vector. So what we would do then is go over here to triggers and say, okay, on a schedule, we want to, run this, we say, every hour at 0 minutes past the hour, right? So at the top of the hour, basically this workflow will run. It will check all of our Google Docs for changes, and it will, pull this into our vector. So there's a bunch of options for, different intervals you can do here. If you're comfortable with cron syntax, you can also write that here as well. So again, for folks who are a little bit more technical and comfortable in those details, we do expose that as an option here. So set this up and configure it however you like. But we have now the ability to have Google Docs in a vector. And so this sort of ingestion workflow was actually what we set up for all of our different data sources as well. So this is how, every few hours we crawl all of our different Confluence spaces and pull all of our Confluence docs into a vector. Same thing for our linear tickets and for our public documentation as well. So anything that's on docs.retool.com, we're able to get that data in as well. So folks in support and folks who are working in the community can also use this to say, okay, hey, what does Retool support for, agents look like? Or is there a way to schedule a workflow? And it would be able to look at our public documentation and find that. So at a high level, what we have here is basically the user has the ability to ask a question. We go through and do each of these resource queries. So how this breaks down is basically RetoolGPT on the front end calls a sort of backend workflow that looks at what model is being used, and looks at all the different tools that the user has selected. So we have these different branches of, okay, if the user has asked to include Confluence, make sure we go query the Confluence vector for some data here. If the user has asked to, use Google Docs or use linear, make sure we query the linear resource here. And so what that actually looks like, and I'll show that here in this workflow, is that, for example, when we have our start trigger, we can basically do something called a branch. And basically what this would say is, if we had some sort of variable set, like search Confluence, we could say, okay, if search Confluence is true, then we want to take some action. We could also add, the else and say, okay, otherwise, we don't want to take action, right? So what this might look like is we could choose a resource query. And again, we could make this query, a database or anything else, but we might want to query Retool vectors. And so in addition to doing an upsert on the document, you can also do things like list all of the vectors. You can do a semantic search, which is what we're doing in this case. We're basically taking the input prompt and doing a semantic search to pull the most relevant documents from a particular vector. Again, you can create vectors, you can do upserts, inserts, all this different stuff. But basically what we're doing in our example here is if the user decides to search Confluence, we're running, a semantic search on the vector. We'd be able to pass, the start, whatever data was passed in, the user's query. And it would basically then, from the vector that we've selected, would be able to pull us the most relevant documents. So we could then sort of stitch those documents together on the back end, and use those to provide the response that the user was looking for. Again, like we saw earlier, this response with a linked to our Confluence, right? So we have this workflow where we're basically branching, looking at all these different tools conditionally on whether the user has checked off these various checkboxes down here at the bottom, and that started to get a little complicated. But what we realized is it actually did a pretty good job at, doing all this branching, coming back and, giving the user an answer. But as we started thinking about how to add more tools, and how to add more different data sources, we started to think that maybe this workflow wasn't the best. The other thing that we had to deal with at the time when we built this was the fact that the user can select different models means that we had to include branches for all of those models in the workflow as well. But one thing I did want to highlight is that this is actually quite easy now. We don't have to include all of these branches anymore. What we can do is if we have an AI action here, let's just drag this up here, for example, an AI action, you'll notice that in addition to the dropdown here, that where you can pick all of the different models you have associated with your Retool account. So let's just say we'll pick Cloud Sonnet 4. There's also this FX button, right? So what this lets you do is provide the specific model that you want to use dynamically. So if, for example, the user picked a model from the dropdown and we had that over here in our start trigger, let's say, okay, we want to be able to let the user dynamically pass this model in. Then instead of having to pick and have a hard-coded dropdown here, what we can do is we can actually, once again, use Retool's double curly brace syntax to say, okay, cool. Whatever model the user passes into this workflow is the one we'll use. So that was able to simplify the logic quite a bit. But we still had so many branches for, okay, has the user decided they wanted to use Confluence? Has the user said they want to use linear, like all these different stuff? These were all different branches that all kind of then had to coalesce at the end, right? So we started thinking about kind of what's next, what the future direction for this was. And this kind of coincided nicely with the rise of AI agents. And so what we thought was, okay, well, cool. We actually would love for the model to basically be able to choose what tools make sense on its own. And sometimes there are questions that, based on the information they get back, require kind of a follow-up sort of search or a kind of rerunning of that same flow that we looked at. And so we thought, okay, wouldn't it be cool to kind of have the ability to basically call the workflow again, and use the information we learned from the first time through to get even better information the second time, right? And so you can actually do this inside of workflows, and we have. You can recursively have a workflow call itself. So in our kind of early versions of this, we were saving a row to the database that said this message has been sent, this research has been done, and then calling the workflow again, letting it look at what was already saved in the database and get all of that kind of past context. But it becomes a little bit clunky to do that. And so there were all these kind of rough edges that we had to deal with. And basically that kind of inspired us and led us to build Retool agents, which we released just over a month ago. And this allows, folks to configure large language models, equip them with various different tools, and let the large language models decide, how to call those tools, what order to call them in, how to use them to get the best possible answer. So this is an agent, for example, that I sent it that I just booked a call with Tim at apple.com, and can you help me do some preparation? And so it basically goes through, it uses the tools like searching the web, creating a Google Doc, writing to a Google Doc, all these tools that it has access to kind of perform a similar type of beginning to end workflow, but the path there is a little bit more winding. The AI is able to choose the path that it takes to get the best answer, which unlocks a whole new set of possibilities and things that we can automate. So we'll be taking a much deeper look at this on Friday. Tomorrow, we're going to go even deeper on workflows. So to give you a little bit of more kind of in-depth context about how these things are built and configured, and how they sort of ladder up to agents. But just wanted to, like, the future of RetoolGPT is basically it will be built as an agent. And so it will have even more flexibility to call all these different tools. It will make it even easier for us to add new data sources and things. And this very complex sort of branching workflow that we have set up will be able to be retired because we have a much more elegant architecture for this sorts of thing now. So tune in on Friday for a look at agents. And if you want to go deeper on workflows and things, come join us again tomorrow. So that's all we had for kind of presentation today. I hope this was helpful and insightful. And I did want to get to some of the questions that folks have been leaving in the chat. So just a reminder that if this is kind of spurring anything for you or questions or things you want to kind of dive into, please either drop those in the chat or in the Zoom Q&A. And Sarah, Daniel, Tess, or Taylor will grab them for me, and we'll get to them here one at a time. So let's go through some of these. So David asks, do we need API keys for Anthropic, OpenAI, and DeepSeek, or are the models included? So the short answer here is some of both. Retool does provide a Retool managed OpenAI key. And what this allows you to do is when you create a brand new account, you can basically go in and start using AI right away inside your apps and your workflows. The caveat there is that there is somewhat of a usage cap on that. So when you're ready to ship something to production, you'll want to swap this out for your own keys. So you'll see that we have a few different Retool managed integrations here, specifically towards using agents. But you can come down here at any point and set up your own API keys. So for example, if you started hitting these rate limits for the OpenAI managed key, you could come down here, hit setup, and then paste your API key in here. And then it would be using your OpenAI credentials, your OpenAI access, and you would be billed, by OpenAI for that sort of thing. So you can do either of those, but we again, kind of the pattern of Retool, and we see this over and over through the platform, is that we want to make it really easy for folks to get started, but we don't want to kind of hold you back if you want to, go all the way to production and expand those use cases. So we do offer both there. Joseph asks, what's the case for building a tool like this versus using a tool like Guru or Notion AI? Yeah, that's a good question. I think, obviously there are a lot of tools that do similar things in a kind of tangential way. Each have their own sort of opinions about how they do certain things. For me, I think one of the things about Retool is the overall platform has so many different pieces in it that, it's very easy for me to bounce between things and spin up something as complex as like a RetoolGPT when there's so many moving pieces, right? So if you use a tool that's much more targeted towards app building, maybe you'll get the front end and that sort of component experience, et cetera, but you won't have, the database that you need to store our threads and our messages. And so in Retool's case, I can just reach over for RetoolDB. They already work together very well. And that is great. If you use kind of a database provider with a front end on top of it, they might not have, the workflows piece that's required to pull in all that vector data on an ongoing basis, and do all that stuff. If you use a tool like N8N or something like that that has the workflows piece, maybe you don't always have the UI. And so if folks on your team need that UI to interact with what you've built, that's something that you need to reach for a separate tool for. Whereas with Retool, we have, the UI, database, the ability to store vector data, the ability to store other data. We also have Retool storage as well if you just want to store flat files, as well as workflows, and all of those kind of components come together and let you build things like AI agents as well. So we basically are able to meet you sort of wherever you are. And if you just want to use one piece of the product, that's totally cool. But like I said, when you're ready to do something a bit more expansive, you can integrate all those pieces together and they work together really nicely. Great. Can you show us examples of these vectors? They're still fairly large, right? Yeah, this is where it gets a little bit tricky because, again, this is internal sort of company data. And so we have to be a little bit careful with what we show on a live stream, obviously. But yeah, they are still fairly large. One of the things that is nice about sort of the vector format, though, is that using that semantic search sort of AI action, we're able to basically slice through these vectors and pull out just the relevant portions. Another thing that we have going for us is that these vectors are basically sort of mathematical representations of the underlying data. And so instead of doing like, a slow query in SQL is like a full text search, for example. That's not what we're doing here. We're basically just doing this sort of semantic search, which is able to be a lot quicker because, code and computer systems are great at dealing with numbers and representations that are numerical. And so, that is working in our favor. So even though we do have, I think 4,000 something documents in Confluence, we have, thousands of linear tickets and things like that. We still are able to get results quite quickly from these sorts of things, just because of kind of the architecture that we've set up and the fact that vectors are, a good sort of data format for this type of thing. So yeah, hope that's helpful. And again, I would encourage you to kind of dive in and see, set up your own vectors and things like that. But yeah, sorry we couldn't show some more of how that kind of works under the scenes. If you do want to see that, again, I would encourage you to go back and watch Angelique's talk from yesterday, where she did a deep dive into vectors and how they work in Retool. Cool. Keen asks, are there any other vector databases that Retool has connections with currently or plans to, or we need to connect them with a REST API resource? Yeah, so I think the biggest kind of vector database provider that folks are familiar with is Pinecone. And we don't have a native Pinecone integration today. So the easiest way to do that would be to kind of do that REST connection that you're talking about. But we are adding new integrations all the time. And so especially now with the rise of some of these other very popular AI tools, we do want to make that pretty seamless. And so that's something we are always exploring. So if you have, a need or a want for a particular integration, I would encourage you to post a thread in the community. And so, other folks can chime in, and also, folks from our engineering team and our community support folks are always watching those threads. And that does have an impact on what we build. So if you have a use case for wanting a sort of more native integration to Pinecone, that would be where I would look there, or any other AI tool that you use. I know myself personally, I'm always kind of browsing those and seeing what people are asking for, and so yeah, I would encourage you to post there in the community. Cool. Let's take some more of these. Michael asks, we want to incrementally ingest new content during the day into Retool vectors, like scheduled for every 10 minutes. Is there an elegant way to prevent concurrent workflow executions if the previous execution took longer than 10 minutes? Yeah, this is a good question. And something that we've actually dealt with quite a bit. We don't have sort of a native way in Retool workflows to prevent don't run if the workflow is already running. But what you could do to kind of get around this situation is basically create a table in RetoolDB and say, okay, cool. We have either like a Boolean value or so workflow is running, just like true false. Or you could have, a time and date stamp, which is something we will look at tomorrow for if you want to query data on a recurring basis, but you don't want to query data you've already queried. We basically use this technique of saving a date stamp to the Retool database table, and then we're able to get that the next time the workflow runs. So how this would work basically is if you had a workflow running, your first step would be to update that value in the database, like workflow is running, to true. And then any subsequent workflow executions would basically check if that value in the database was true. It would know that a workflow was already running, and it would just exit early. Otherwise, if the workflow had finished, it would set it back to false. And then the next time the workflow was called, the next 10-minute span, it would see, okay, that value is false. There's no other workflow running. And then, that's fine. We can start our next execution. So that would be one way to do it, and something you could experiment with. And again, another benefit of having a built-in database tool where you can just quickly store some data for that type of thing. Cool. Mike asks, welcome back, by the way. How about Office documents like Word and Excel instead of Google Docs? Ours are in the cloud and Ignite. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. It seems like Ignite to me, but we'll see. Yeah, good question. I will say that there's nothing preventing you from building a workflow that converts Word and Excel docs into vector data. The only issue there would basically just be what is the underlying document format of those, and is there sort of an API or some other way to get at them, essentially, right? So if there's an API, Retool can connect to it. If a system has an API, Retool can connect to it, whether it's REST or SOAP or anything like that. So if there's a way to pull those documents out and they're in a format that you can parse with either Python or JavaScript, you could build a workflow to parse them. And so that would be totally possible. It would just depend on what limitations there were on getting those documents out of that system, right? Cool. Another question from Keen. Does Retool vectors use the same 5 GB limit of database? Is there a payment structure for exceeding that limit like workflows? Or is it simply a cap and we need to move to another vector database at that point? From what we've been able to track down, and I'm leaning on some folks from the community team and who are in the chat here, it seems like the limits are similar to RetoolDB and that there's a cap on that. But this is one I will actually investigate and see what I can find here on a little bit of a deeper dive. I'll reach out to some of the team that manages this and see what we can do. And I'll make sure to post an update to this in the community thread for today, day 3. But it's a good question. I think as with most of the systems that we have set up inside of Retool, the limits are pretty generous, and even folks who are using them for production use cases very rarely run into those limits. So it would definitely be worth, like investigating your use case if you're going to think you have that much data. But I'll make sure to follow up on this one in the community thread. Thanks for the question. Chris asks, if we wanted to build something like this and have it act as an intelligent co-pilot inside an internal platform, would we be able to do so? Yeah, absolutely. So it really depends on sort of the UI that you want to expose, right? So in our example, we have crafted it as obviously it has its own GPT UI, like the Chat GPT style UI, but all of the hard work is sort of happening on the back end in a workflow. And what this means is that workflows can be triggered via webhooks, which means you can trigger them via any sort of post request. So in whatever platform you are building, what internal platform you want it to be a copilot for, you would just have to kind of build the UI pieces that you wanted in that platform, but you could then basically hit the backend workflow that had been trained on all the relevant vector data with post request and get that data back. But you would just be responsible for sort of the UI piece there, which would be the only thing that you would have to sort of manage if you weren't building that instead of Retool. Cool. Godfrey asks, what if different applications want to use different API keys? How do we manage that at a platform level? Yeah, this is a really great question. And I will say that our resources team is thinking quite a bit about this and is starting to work on how to make this possible. So what that's going to look like is just like you can have multiple database resources that connect to different databases. Instead of having just one AI resource where you have to put your API keys, you'll be able to have, okay, here's an OpenAI resource with this API key, here's an Anthropic resource with this API key. And so you'll be able to say, okay, cool, here is the OpenAI resource for the marketing team with this specific API key. You'll be able to use Retool's governance features to basically lock that down to only folks in the marketing team can use this resource. And so that will allow you to do that sort of granular like dividing of the resources that you're talking about there. So that will be hopefully in the next few months or the next second half of the year here. You'll have the ability to do those sorts of things in Retool because that's been a pretty common request from folks. Cool. Soul asks, do we need to connect with tools like make.com to go to additional functionality to connect with other apps? Or does Retool have that built in to make multi-step functional agents? If so, do you have an API to pull it into make.com and send back data? Yeah, good question. And a multi-part question. So I'll take these one at a time. Do we need to connect with tools like make.com to connect with other apps, or does Retool have the built-in functionality to make multi-step functional agents? Yeah, so this gets a little bit to what we'll be talking about on Friday. We will actually show you how to build those multi-step agents inside of Retool. Those agents can then be called either via a chat, they can be called via an app by your end users, or they can be triggered via a workflow as well, which means they can respond to things like Slack messages or pings from GitHub or events happening in Stripe, etc. So more to come on that on Friday. The short answer is, again, we try to make Retool as comprehensive of a platform as possible, and so all of these things you can do within the Retool platform if you want to. But at the same time, all like I mentioned before, all the workflows that we looked at can be triggered via API request, which means you could trigger them via make. They can also make their own API requests, which means if you did a bunch of work in a workflow and needed to push that back into make for some reason, you could do that as well. So instead of sending data back to the UI like we're doing in our example, you could send data back to make. You could also send data back to Slack or anywhere else that you were calling this tool. So it's pretty flexible, and it does integrate well with these other systems. But one of the things that I like is that when I'm trying to build something in Retool, I'm not reaching for all of these different tools, right? I can just use the tools that are built into the platform. Cool. Thomas asks, follow-up question, how did including the vectors affect token usage? Are you seeing significant increases in costs when you include them? Yeah, I mean, so at the core of how vectors work, you're adding more data to your prompt, right? So there will be some increase in token usage because you're giving the model more context, right? So if you use a vector store in your prompt, you're basically saying, okay, here's the prompt, here's the question I'm asking you, and by the way, here's some other relevant data. So we see people do this all the time with tools like ChatGPT, where they paste in like an entire document, for example, and say, cool, summarize this document, right? And that obviously the entire document increases the token count. But with vectors, it's a little bit more efficient because it's actually kind of slicing through all the potential documents it can include and choosing to include only the relevant segments to the particular user's question, right? And so we do see an increase in token consumption just because you are including more data than just your prompt. But it's also more efficient than, for example, dumping an entire document or an entire set of documents into the prompt from a token consumption perspective. Awesome. Ashley, I feel I need to preface this question with I'm a novice and trying to learn from a very limited basic knowledge. Well, fantastic to have you here. Thank you for coming to join, and thank you for learning. No need to preface at all. We take all sorts of questions here. Do you have a list of integrated or offered actions within each of the components, or should this be learned through trial and error? Yeah, this is a good question. I'm not sure if you're speaking about the AI component specifically, the AI action specifically, but I will just dive into that a little bit. So let's see. Let's just spin up a new app real quick here. And so when you create this sort of AI query that we were talking about earlier, there are a few different things that you can do here. So generate text is, the one that most folks use most often, I would say, maybe followed closely by generate chat response. That was what we saw earlier with our chat component. But you could also do things like summarize text, or you can classify text, which means, okay, this is useful for things like sentiment analysis or things like that. You can extract an entity from text. So I've used this for, I have an app that I can upload a super dense sort of real estate listing PDF to. And I wanted to extract like the price, the square footage, and maybe the zip code, for example. So I would then down here just say, okay, I want to extract, a price sort of entity, etc. And it would go through these documents and pull out just this particular type of data for me. So you can kind of experiment with lots of these actions. Convert document to text is another good one. If you have like a PDF upload, for example, like we were just talking about, you need to get it into an actual text format to pass it to the LLM. And so this AI action will be your source for that. So there are a bunch of different actions that happen in here. But if you're talking about the components themselves, sorry about that, trying to click around all the Zoom UI as well. The components themselves, you'll notice, have a bunch of configuration settings. Most of them do. I have it hidden just because I want more kind of real estate on my screen here, but you can see actually over here it popped out. And here are sort of all the different ways that you can configure these different components. So you can do everything from, okay, what actions do we want the user to be able to take? So do we want them to be able to copy messages or not? What do we want the actual name of the AI to be? So if we say, for example, like AI bot, right now, when we ask a question, we will see, instead of the response come back from Retool AI, it comes back from AI bot. So each of these components that you drag onto the canvas or that you configure in a different way has this inspector panel over here too, where you can go and say, okay, well, cool. Like what query do I want it to actually use? It auto-populated one for us, but how do we like dive into this and see really what's going on? This inspector is a really powerful tool here. And some of these even have, different kind of nested states where you can see, okay, cool. What do I want to do to configure my header, right? So maybe I don't want them to be able to, download this chat, right? So I can just click this here and you'll notice, now our download button's gone, etc. So yeah, absolutely dive in, check it out. If you have a particular component, the docs are quite good. So again, docs.retool.com will give you detailed information on every single component that we have. And hopefully that's helpful. Great. Yeah, we have a question from Chris here. Speaking of Slack, is there anything we need to worry about in regards to the changes they made in regards to their API usage for LLMs? Yeah, it's a good question. So for folks who don't know, Slack recently came out basically enforced some stricter API limits on how you can get your data basically out of Slack, or how you can use your Slack data with other tools. And so I think there's still a fair bit of like clarification that will happen with those policies. But yeah, a lot of it is around, ingesting historical data and like training a large language model on all of your company's Slack data, for example. So definitely a case where you would want to sort of review the terms of that API and the privacy policies. We're definitely not, encouraging you to build anything that violates the terms that Slack have set for their own API. But I think for the most part, like things like triggering this tool from Slack or interacting with agents and things that you build via Slack is well within the terms that I've seen. And so that's not something I would worry about. It's really just it's a step that a lot of kind of sources of data are taking, Reddit and others included on the public internet of we see this source of data as something that's very valuable, and we don't want folks to be able to train large language models on it. And so you can have your own opinions on whether you have rights to your own company data or Slack does. And I think that may be something that will be litigated in public opinion over the next few months. But yeah, definitely check the terms of service there, because I expect that to be something that will change. Cool. Michael asks, when using Gemini as a model in a Retool AI action, is there a way to set the flag that activates the Gemini feature grounding with search or maps? Yeah, good question. And actually a pretty common feature request. And one of the reasons that the resources team, like I mentioned, is working on splitting out these individual AI providers into their own resources. We've had a lot of requests for example, when OpenAI came out with deep research, or wanting to use their structured output flag so that you got, a structured JSON or XML or whatever output every single time. And currently, because all the resources are grouped together under one sort of AI umbrella, that's not possible. So the way to do that would basically be to do a custom REST API integration. So you would just basically call the Gemini model via a REST API instead of the native Retool AI integration, and you would be able to then pass it whatever sort of flags you wanted. So that REST API integration is always there as a sort of backup if you want to do something that's not supported natively. And in this case, yeah, that's what I would recommend. Cool. Alex Baker asks, I'm building a RAG chatbot on another platform, but would like to use Retool as a front end. When chunking text to store in a vector database, do you have a recommendation on the chunking method? Do you recommend a certain chunk size and overlap size? And how does Retool handle the chunking? Yeah, okay, good question. Also a multi-part question. So I'll take these one at a time. When chunking text to store in a vector database, do you have a recommendation on the chunking method? Yeah, this is a topic of lots of research. And it's interesting that the question and the answer kind of comes down to like, well, it kind of depends on your data. And so I think that, there are a lot of different, especially if you're using something like LangChain, different like text splitters and text chunking algorithms and chunking choices and things like that. The common theme that I've seen is it really comes down to how granular you want to be able to query your data. So, for example, if you are importing a book into a vector store and you want to be able to pull quotes that are individual sentences, well, in that case, it may make sense to chunk the book into individual sentences so that when you're doing a semantic search, it's searching for the most relevant sentences as opposed to paragraphs or pages or other things like that. So unfortunately, the answer is kind of you have to experiment with your particular data set. It's kind of hard to say. Yeah, same thing goes for chunk size and overlap size. This is the difficulty with building sort of production RAG systems, is that you do need to do a fair bit of experimentation and have a set of probably 10 to 20 questions that you feel like, okay, it should be able to give really good answers for, and this is kind of our golden test case set. And then that would allow you to experiment with different chunk sizes and overlap, and kind of run it through that evaluation multiple times and see kind of what works best for you. How does Retool handle the chunking? That's a good question. We have kind of a set of rules that we across our experimentation have found works for most of the use cases that we support. But I will say that you can do this yourself if you're using something like Pinecone or another tool. If you are using Retool vectors, when you go to create a vector, you can choose sort of the embedding model, which again will have different sort of side effects on how your data is ingested, etc. So we don't expose that really in this. That's not a knob you can turn in the vector settings, but we do give you the choice of a couple different embedding models. And if you do want that sort of granular control, that's where like you mentioned, you would use another sort of external system or or something like Pinecone to have that control. But the kind of best I can say here is really just kind of experiment with having the, sort of, if our chatbot answered all these questions perfectly, this would be a win for us. And then kind of experiment with things like chunk size, overlap, etc., to kind of find what works best for you. Yeah. Cool. And we got another one here in the chat. Cloudflare blocking AI crawlers is such a step back in the AI space. Do you guys have a workaround to deal with this when building agents that go and do research? Yeah, good question. So for folks that have not heard about this, Cloudflare this week, I believe, basically came out and said, hey, we're going to basically turn on AI bot blocking for all of the websites and things that we manage. And so again, this is in response to a large part of how all these large language models were trained is the fact that it was able to crawl basically the entire public internet and get a bunch of data that was going to train the model. And so depending on whether you are someone who's building with AI or a site that has a lot of data, like we talked about with Reddit or tools like Slack and things like that, you have different opinions probably on whether this is good or bad. And so I will say that it's something like we are actively looking into and seeing how we can best kind of strike that balance between supporting the open web and the data that we all use every day, and also allowing folks to build really powerful tools. And so we'll get a little bit more into detail on kind of our web search tool and how that works within agents on Friday. So it seems like you have some pretty specific agents questions. So I really do encourage you to come back on Friday. That's an area that I'm super passionate about and have worked pretty closely with the product team on for a while now. So more to come on agents on Friday. But yeah, this is definitely something we're keeping an eye on, just because it is changing kind of how AI tools work and how the web as a whole works, right? And so something to keep an eye on for sure. Cool. Can we create a workflow that reads our internal Confluence knowledge documents and create a retool vector out of it? Would that work? Absolutely. And that's actually exactly what we did for this tool, right? So one of the ways, the way that Confluence data gets ingested into our retool vector is a workflow that runs, I believe, every 12 or every 24 hours, and basically loops through all of our different Confluence spaces, all of our different Confluence documents, and one by one, just like we showed with the Google Docs example, basically turns those into vector data, compares them against what's already stored, and decides, do we need to create a new vector document for this? Do we need to update an existing one? Or how does that work? So that workflow is just constantly running in the background, which means that as people add to and change Confluence documentation, our RetoolGPT tool always stays up to date. So that's where workflows really comes into play, where those things can just run in the background. And even when the underlying data changes, you can have your vector stores always up to date for any of your AI tools. Cool. Lots of questions. Any last questions we have? We still have just a couple minutes left, but if you have anything else we want to go over, drop them in the chat. But again, thanks everybody for coming today. It was really good to see all this engagement, and I love kind of hanging out with y'all and chatting, even though it's a little bit one way on video at least. And yeah, excited to see folks back tomorrow. We will be diving deep into workflows, how those work. And we'll be taking a look at how we built a workflow that basically monitors social media for mentions of Retool, uses a little bit of AI to decide whether someone's talking about Retool, the company, or retooling like their sports team lineup, for example, or their fantasy football league or something like that. So a lot of false positives out there where you're able to use AI to help us with that particular automation. And then, as we mentioned, Friday we'll be diving into agents, all the different tools that go into building one of those, and how building those agents works inside the Retool platform. So thanks everybody for coming today. Excited to see you for days 4 and 5, and also over in the community to recap and answer any questions that folks didn't get to ask live. So thanks for coming, and we'll see you next time.